So I'm really excited to see our friend Michaela with us again tonight. Michaela is an interpretive writer and researcher based in New York. Her past experiences include work for the New York Botanical Garden and the Smithsonian Institution. Based on the research she conducted in Holyoke over the summer of 2021, Michaela will explore the city's most significant trees and the stories they tell about our local history and landscape. Please help me welcome Michaela Wright.
Thank you. Thanks, Penny. So happy to be back with the Wisteria Hearst family. And so excited to share with you guys about the trees and the world that I entered this summer. So I'm just gonna try to share this. Can everyone see? I'm gonna hit present here in a minute. Let's see. All right. Can we still see it or is it in the, yeah, okay. All right. So there's some cool trees in Holyoke. So I just wanted to start, Penny kind of hinted at it, but I just want to kind of start by imagining the Holyoke landscape sort of long ago, before sort of the introduction of human intervention in the landscape. Um, trees are such an interesting part of our landscape because, as Penny mentioned, I think a lot of us go through life not noticing them, or maybe we have a favorite here and there, but for the most part, they sort of melt into the background. They're a very malleable symbol. And I think throughout time, humans have had a lot of different kinds of relationships with trees, from the period in which they maybe provided a huge amount of sustenance and nutrients, to now when maybe we're a little bit concerned that they're going to crush our house, or we don't notice them at all. So if everyone just wants to pop in the chat if they have a favorite tree in Holyoke, preferably. It could be in your yard, it could be a city tree. I just kind of want to get a feel for what everyone's relationship to the trees of Holyoke are. So if you're comfortable sharing, we need to go into presentation mode? Yes, we can do that. It's weird, so it won't let me look at my notes when it's in presentation mode. So if it's okay, I'm just going to leave it like this. Can everyone see okay? Okay, we got the Copper Beech at Wisteria-Hearst. I think maybe the one across the street, Penny. Yeah, that one's gorgeous. And I'll circle back because the guy who designed a lot of the parks in Holyoke in the early 1900s loved copper beeches and put them in all of his parks. We have a giant ginkgo at Smith. Yes, I think I might know the one you're talking about. That's beautiful. Shingle oak at Community Field. Yes, that one is incredible. I think it might be dying. And Jean says the Japanese maple in my yard. Those are stunning as well. So yeah, thanks guys. And like, it's fine if you want to keep adding them. And if you have any questions that you want me to answer, I would love to have this be, interactive. So don't feel like you can't interrupt with pressing thoughts, questions, whatever. So I mentioned that I would love it if we could start um, thinking about the landscape before humans. So I have these pictures, which of course were created by humans, so not quite pre-human, but thinking about the Holyoke landscape in a different way than we think of it today. And there is a tree. This is a tree called the Kentucky coffee tree. I'm not going to even attempt the botanical Latin, but you can, if you're muted, you can practice it at home. This one is in Forestdale Cemetery. It's right near the entrance, actually, so it's pretty easy to spot. Here's a close-up of its leaves. And I'm starting here because this is actually a pretty rare tree, but it gives us some really interesting clues about our prehistoric history here in Holyoke. So these trees today are very rare. Their native range is a little bit more towards the south and the Midwest. And they're rare today because they are they have what we call an evolutionary anachronism. So the Kentucky coffee tree actually evolved with megafauna and dinosaurs. So the pods I hope you can see those. They're in the legume family, so their seed pods grow like green beans almost. Green beans are a legume. Their seed pods, this is them as they when they first emerge in the summer, but as they age, they turn brown. And this species has an incredibly tough um, seed pod, and they're also toxic. So no animals that are alive today can eat the fruit and seeds of the Kentucky coffee tree. And the tree itself has no other methods of seed dispersal, which basically gives us the clue that this tree used to have a better method of seed disposal, and that was dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, or megafauna, as like the scientists call them, had the correct jaw size and could tolerate the toxicity of the Kentucky coffee trees seed pods. So that would have been an excellent food for them. And of course, then the seeds get distributed from those animals' excrement across the landscape. So that's why they're relatively rare today. But one of the reasons why they may still be around is actually because starting with the indigenous communities who were living in the central Massachusetts region, basically they figured out that this tree's seeds can be roasted, which removes the toxicity and used as a medicine or made into basically like a hot beverage, essentially. And so we think that the range of the coffee tree, the natural range where we would find this in the wild, was actually expanded by indigenous peoples propagating this useful tree by spreading its seeds around. And it actually gets its name because when colonists entered the sort of Kentucky region, they met the Meskwaki, Ho-Chunk, and Pawnee, who showed them how to make this hot beverage that they made. And the settlers compared it to coffee and used it as a coffee substitute in times when coffee was pretty rare. And we're going to come back to this very cool tree. I thought we would start here and end here. So keep that one in the back of your mind. Okay, so moving forward, again, thinking about this pre-colonial landscape, the forest here in central Massachusetts was comprised primarily of an oak chestnut ecological community. And not a ton has changed in terms of the species that grow here. But anytime you cut down an old growth forest, the same thing never grows back, right? You lose a huge amount of biodiversity anytime you're cutting sort of like virgin territory. And another thing that's changed hugely is the chestnut component of that oak chestnut ecological community. The American chestnut was once very, very common in forests of the Northeast and especially in Massachusetts and here in Holyoke. And it went what we call functionally extinct in the early 1920s and 30s. A fungal blight came over from Europe and wiped out every single extant American chestnut. There are maybe like 90 specimens that survive in the world today. And they have sort of genetic mutations that help them survive. So a little bit different, but in the sort of pre-contact forests of central Massachusetts, we would have seen primarily oaks and then chestnut varieties. So like horse chestnut is still a very common one in this area. And then of course, peppered in are a bunch of other support species, hickory. I can tell you where to forage for hickory nuts if you guys are interested in Holyoke. Sugar, maple, beech, birch, hemlock, and pine. Now, since we're talking about the pre-contact contact era, just give a little nod to the fact that yes, there were indigenous people here first. The area that is Holyoke was not a permanent settlement at the point of contact. It was probably used as hunting land or access point to the river for fishing. But there were Nonotucks in and near Northampton, Woronokos in Westfield and West Springfield, and Agawams near Springfield as well, presumably also near Agawam, as I think it's named for them. They're all part of the Pocumtuck language group. And that period of first contact, if you want to get like a date for the time frame that we're thinking about, is sort of the early 1630s is when first contact is made and the first settlers are coming into this region. Right here, I have a picture of an eastern white pine, which are still today and were 400 or 500 years ago a critical component of the native forests of central Massachusetts. I took this picture In the Mohawk State Forest, there is a grove there called the Elder Grove of some of the tallest eastern white pines in Massachusetts. And the eastern white pine is still today one of the tallest trees that grows in the entire East Coast. And in the early contact period, they actually typically grew almost over 200 feet. Today, they don't go much higher than like 150 feet. And again, that's because once you lose old growth forest, everything that grows back is not quite the same. We have more pollutants. So trees today are a little different. Another critical component of that early forest that covered Holyoke is the hemlock, also called Tsuga canadensis. There is a old growth specimen of hemlock in Glutag Park. I don't know if anybody knows where that is, but that is over sort of in East Holyoke on the other side of like the mountain. There's a nature preserve back there that the city of Holyoke actually just acquired in 2019. They purchased a large parcel of land in order to protect it as a nature preserve. And if you follow one of the trails back there, you can see an old growth hemlock. Hemlock, especially at that age, where they are old, they're big, they have lots of dead branches. They're super important because they can provide habitat and food to over 120 species, which is a really big deal for supporting biodiversity. And the reason why I sort of bring the eastern hemlock into this is because they are now threatened, the eastern hemlock and all hemlock species. There's only 3 hemlock species native to North America. Hemlocks are currently being threatened by the hemlock woody adelgid, which is a pest that's spreading east from the Rocky Mountains. And some scientists predict that we will have lost all hemlock species in the next 300 years. So go out and hug your hemlocks now while we got them. Another important tree in this sort of pre-contact indigenous period is the tulip tree, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It is known as the tallest tree in the Northeast, and they typically grow incredibly straight and tall. So they can be really easy to identify in the forest. If you walk around and you see a tree that's just incredibly tall and straight, and it's a broadleaf tree, not a conifer, then it's probably a tulip tree or a tulip poplar if you are from the South like me. And the tulip tree, because it had these incredibly tall, straight trunks that don't branch off until sort of at the top, it was a really important tree to the indigenous communities that lived here because it was their primary mode of making canoes. And transportation on the water, whether that was the Connecticut River or more towards the east, the ocean, was really important to tribes and to colonists once that sort of point of contact is made. And there's an excellent book called Saltwater Frontier by Andrew Littman that really talks about the maritime practices and how a lot of indigenous boats were made pre-contact, if anyone's interested. So this particular specimen is one of the tulip poplars that is growing behind 1916 Mosher Street, which was in 1917 the School of the Immaculate Conception. And local historian Bob Camo, who maybe some of you guys know, Bob told me he's pretty sure these trees were planted when that school opened in 1917, which puts them at about 100 years old, which seems about right given their very impressive size. Next up, a really cool native plant that I'm sure everyone has heard of. This picture I took also at Glutag Park. If anyone's interested in going and checking it out, there's also a relatively mature specimen at Wisteriahurst, but that is the Sassafras albidium. So sassafras was a really important plant to the native communities here in the Northeast. It was used, let's see, I have a little list here. It was used as a fever reducer. It was used for skin issues like acne. It was used on wounds, and it was used for urinary disorders by different tribes of the Northeast and the South. And I know specifically the Delaware Indians, which were just north of the Pocumtuck in New York, called it Winnock. And there's tons of other indigenous language words for the sassafras plant, which indicates how widely it was known and utilized by the indigenous people here in North America. Like with the Kentucky coffee tree, at that point of contact in the 16 and 1700s, the Native Americans immediately share knowledge about the sassafras with the colonists of Massachusetts specifically, and it becomes early on a really important export that is going from America back to Europe. And the colonists who learned of this from the Indians, basically called it a miracle cure. That's how it was marketed in Europe, and it was a very lucrative export. That sort of trickles off pretty quickly because once it gets to Europe, people sort of begin to doubt its efficacy. It doesn't quite prove itself worthy, but it continues to be exported as like a flavor provider, a spice almost. And even in the late 1890s, which is when this ad here is from, it's still considered a sort of health food. Sassafras, maybe we all know, becomes the flavor for root beer. The root and the oil produced by the root of sassafras gives it that sort of spicy smell. So it continues to be considered sort of like a health food, for over 400 years, which I think is pretty cool. Today, we know that the roots and the root oil of sassafras are actually a known carcinogen. So we don't recommend going out and trying to make your own root beer. That's why all root beer is now flavored artificially. But you can make tea with the leaves still, and that is safe. And I just included a picture of the leaves here because as you can see, sassafras trees do not grow a uniform leaf like most trees do. So you can find 3, sometimes 4 different shapes of leaf on one sassafras tree. We have these sort of cool 3-lobed dinosaur, I call them dinosaur print shaped leaves. We have the mittens, which are 2-lobed, and then some leaves that form no lobes at all. And you can see on this picture that I included, there's leaves of many different shapes that grow. And scientists are actually still not entirely sure why that happens, which I think is really cool. Little tree mystery. Moving forward in time, we have the first Europeans coming into Holyoke. And trees are, of course, a very important part of that landscape. I throw this one in there. This is a specific tree that is no longer standing. In the early 1700s, when the first of the Ball family emigrated, the resources that I found actually do not list a first name. So whoever was the sort of patriarch of the Ball family and established the Ball homestead on what became Northampton Avenue, Northampton Street, planted in the 1700s an elm to sort of symbolize their making that into their homestead. And it becomes a really important wayfinder for over 200 years in the city of Holyoke. You can see there it is pictured on a map of Holyoke that was created in 1893. So about 30 years after the city was incorporated, and almost 200 years after approximately we think that this tree was planted. It's the only sort of living thing that's pictured on the map. The map, in fact, as you can see, doesn't even show very many buildings. So the fact that this tree was included means that it was likely a very important waymarker in that period. And here is, I believe, a picture of the elm before it was knocked down in the early 1900s. Don't quote me on that. Impossible to know if that is in fact the same elm that was planted in the 1700s, but there you go. Moving forward through time again, this is a picture of Germania Park. This is today called Bonin Field, and that's in South Holyoke, I think. Before this was Bonin Field, which is now like a softball, baseball field. In the 1890s, 1860s through the 1890s, this was the central hub for the German community here in Holyoke. I probably don't have to go over like Holyoke history in terms of paper being obviously critical to the development of Holyoke. And when Holyoke starts to industrialized. Obviously, most of the mills, many of the mills are staffed by immigrants. Immigrants from all over Europe. Germania mills ended up being staffed primarily by German immigrants. And so we had the Germania mills housing here. You can see kind of behind the trees there in the picture. And then where the camera is situated would have been right in front of the German Lutheran Church. And there are tons of records in the archives of this being a place where the German community gathered regularly, got outside, got some fresh air. City records document that it was a very well-loved park. And today, sorry, I don't have any pictures of these two trees, but there are 2 or 3 trees that remain from the earliest days of this park. So like the 1890s, still in the back of Bonin Field. If you go to sort of like in this picture, what would be sort of the left-hand corner, there is a massive sugar maple, a Norway maple, and some very large oaks that I believe survived from the earliest days of this park. So they're a wonderful reminder of the fact that Holyoke has always been a very diverse place. Another sort of hidden story that some trees still standing in Holyoke can tell us that I thought was really cool. When I first got to Holyoke, I was driving around. I was actually going to the mall to pick up something from the Apple store because my phone broke. And I passed by these beautiful, very large silver maples that are over on, I believe, Holy Family Road. It's by the old geriatric center, which is now defunct. And I think they're going to maybe be putting something new in that, a new geriatric center over there. But I passed these trees and I was like, gosh, those look really old. And they're lining what is essentially today like a back street. It doesn't really go anywhere. It's like an alley almost. So of course I did some digging and I found out looking at old maps that these were the trees that originally lined the front drive to Holyoke's City Farm, which was originally called the Almshouse. In the Victorian period, there's sort of this shift in values towards taking a stance of sort of paternalism to the poor. And it's also sort of an early prototype for essentially social services provided by local and federal government. The almshouse was a social service provided to the people of Holyoke that basically gave a place to live to people who were disabled or too old to work, or were simply unhoused and poor and needed a place to stay. They could move into the almshouse. It was a fully functional farm, and they could work the farm and live there and be basically taken care of by the state. This almshouse that you see here in this picture was constructed probably in the 1880s. There's actually very few records that document almost anything about the early days of City Farm at Holyoke, but you can see in this picture the main building. And then over here in the corner, there was an orchard that I did tramp through the woods looking for. No, there are no remaining orchard trees, but the front entrance would be on the other side of this picture. So we unfortunately cannot see whether or not those silver maples were there when this picture was taken, which I believe is in the 1890s, early 1900s. Since the almshouse, yes, it is, David. I believe it is approximately in the same place where actually the hospital building is. So there's the geriatric center and then there's like the hospital. I think it's about on the same site as the hospital, which is also defunct. So anyways, next time when you're driving by, check those out. There's also some beautiful sycamore trees that I believe also would have been planted at some point during the almshouse's life. It goes defunct in the 1940s sometime, I believe probably during World War II. But there are tons of older Holyoke residents who remember when it was still operational. And if you do remember, I would love to talk to you. Okay, so Paper City grows, Holyoke develops, the urban landscape is shifting rapidly, and in the early 1900s, there's this movement nationally called the City Beautiful movement, and it's really tied in with Victorian values, again, of paternalism, creating this civil society. And the City Beautiful movement really was just this idea that if you planted and trees and flowers that beautified the urban landscape, you would be cultivating civic and social and moral values among its people. It was definitely a little bit of sort of like trying to shape people's behavior by making the city a beautiful place to live. In Holyoke, that really plays out through the renovation of many, many of the public parks, the creation of new public parks in the city in the early 1900s. We have a picture here of Prospect Park, which is today called Pulaski Park. It was renamed in the 1960s, I think. But Pulaski Park, Springdale Park, and several other parks throughout the city were redesigned by the Olmsted brothers in the early 1900s. And at the time, they were like the most elite garden designers, park designers who you could hire. So Holyoke hires this very elite firm to redesign the city's parks. And in this period, we see a massive amount of new trees planted in these new parks. So you can see in this picture, and I'm so sorry, actually do not have a date for this picture, but I believe it's like circa 1910. You can see all of the new saplings that have been installed in what was Prospect Park. To the left here, there is a sugar maple, which I believe remains from that original planting. Not a ton of the trees in the park survived. There was a hurricane in 1938, which wiped out tons of the original trees planted in Holyoke. But definitely this guy is still there, and it has to be at least 100 years old. She's magnificent in person. I highly recommend going and checking this one out. Also Springdale Park, which you can see one of the original pictures here that was taken of the lot before it becomes Springdale Park in 1905. You can see it was actually a racetrack. It was like a race car and carriage, I guess, racing, horse racing track in the early 1900s. And then it's turned into Springdale Park. So you can see it was kind of cleared of trees. But over here in the center, we have this very large elm. It's obviously from a distance in this picture. And in an approximate spot today, there is actually also still growing an American elm. Now, I'm sure it's not the same tree, but kind of coincidentally cool that there's sort of this continuity of the trees that are in the landscape. And I'll come back to this American elm because it's very special. And that's Springdale Park. So a lot of the trees in Springdale Park are original to that 1907 planting. There's a record of a lot of the trees that were planted at that time. And Springdale probably has the most old trees of anywhere else in Holyoke. There are black maples, red maples, black oaks, red oaks, pin oaks. I think there's a few sugar maples. There's some beautiful lindens. You can really see the legacy of the City Beautiful movement in that park still today. The old trees that we have were primarily planted around then. At Wistariahurst, the 19 teens saw the introduction of some very exotic species. Humans are traveling for leisure to further and further sort of corners of the world. And Holyoke's continued growth financially helps make that possible. So Belle Skinner, who lived or owned Wistariahurst with her brother in that period, when she goes to Asia, she is inspired by the gardens that she sees there. So unclear if she got the seeds here, she brought them back, but she installs an Asian inspired garden in 1917. And that is when this beautiful Japanese maple and Chinese yew are planted in the Wistariahurst gardens. And I think they're a wonderful illustration of the fact that you never really can tell how old a tree is by looking at it. The Japanese maple is big for a Japanese maple. They're quite a small tree. And the yew as well. You would never look at these trees and think that they are, massive and old, but both of these are probably almost 100 years old. The yews are quite a petite and slow growing tree. And fun fact, actually, Chinese yew is very important in Chinese traditional medicine, and it has been used for sort of millennia as a medicine, and in recent years has been incorporated into cancer treatment. Basically folk medicine what folk medicine has been practicing for hundreds of years was recognized by modern pharmacologists also to have carcinogenic properties. So pretty cool. Moving forward again, I'm sorry, we're sort of speeding through time here. The Great Depression hits Holyoke, and essentially the city's ability to invest in its parks is pretty heavily curtailed because nobody has any money. And so upon the creation of the Works Progress Administration in the 30s, Holyoke's parks start to get some new investment in them in the late 30s. And pretty much anything that happens in any of the parks in Holyoke were the product of Works Progress Administration funds or labor. And one of the places where that's still very visible is Anniversary Park. I don't know how many of you are longtime Holyoke residents, but you probably remember going to visit Scott Tower at Anniversary Hill. It's sort of fallen into neglect in recent years. But when it was first unveiled in 1938, oh, I got an email. 1938, it looked like this, and it was planted. It was almost entirely cleared of brush, trees, everything. You had a completely unobstructed view of the Holyoke sort of landscape, which is really, would have been really special. And it was planted with these eastern red cedars lining the road up to the tower. Now today, this is completely overgrown with forest, but those eastern red cedars are still there and sort of bear that reminder to this time when the Works Progress Administration was sort of sustaining parks and cities and people across the country. And I was actually able to take a core sample from one of the eastern red cedars that is still there just to double check, because again, they're a slow growing species and they're not very big. And it does have 80 very tightly compact rings, which is consistent with it being planted in the late 1930s. So next time you are feeling adventurous and want to walk up there, see if you can spot them. Okay, I'm coming back to the American elm. Hopefully we all remember this bad boy there on the right. In the 1920s, a fungal disease called Dutch elm disease is introduced through New York ports, and it pretty rapidly starts to kill all of the American elms in the United States. And by 1989, almost 90% of all American elms have been killed by this disease. And this had a massive impact on the tree landscape and the urban landscape everywhere, but in Holyoke as well, because American elms were the #1 street tree before the 1980s. So tons of trees across the city died, leaving the city relatively treeless. And essentially the fallout from the loss of those trees today is why we have the urban treescape that we have today. So almost none of the American elms survived, except for there's a few still in Holyoke, including this one that is pictured in Springdale Park. And when we think about how trees can sort of give us clues about the past, I'll just share a little anecdote. When I first got to Holyoke, I was just driving around trying to look at trees, see if I could spot really big, beautiful ones, old ones that I could put on the inventory for the Holyoke Tree Project. And I remember going to Springdale Park and seeing this American elm, and it has this beautiful, very distinctive bark, which you can kind of see. It's sort of a pale colored bark, but then it has these dark ridges, and it has these very sort of delicate drooping leaves that form almost like an umbrella around it. And I had been able to identify most of the trees that I had seen in Holyoke so far without any issue. And I came back to this tree like 2 or 3 times because I had never seen a tree like this in the landscape before, and certainly not in Virginia, where I'm from. And I talked to Yoni Glogauer, the head of the Department of Conservation and Sustainability, who I was working with on this project. And he was like, oh, it's an American elm, obviously. But because elms are so rare, I had never seen one and I didn't know how to identify it. And so when we see trees like that in the landscape, that we don't see anywhere else, it's sort of like a clue to sort of be like, why is this tree here in a park? That could just be because it's a beautiful specimen tree. But when it's old like this and it was planted 100 years ago, sort of like, we should tune in and figure out why this is here, and something else. And I don't see it anywhere else. So we lose most of the American elms, and in their place are planted in Holyoke predominantly two species. One is the Norway maple, which is here on the left in that picture with the leaves, and what is called samaras, which is the seed pod of maples. They're sort of those winged things and they can fly. They're really cool. And the Callery pear, which is the flowering little tree that you see here. And so when it comes time to pick trees to replace a lot of the elms that were lost, these were two of the species that foresters in the 1980s went towards, because they were, especially the Norway maple, very hardy, could tolerate urban conditions like pollution, flooding. And so they're planted like bananas. They're planted everywhere. In the 1980s, they were planting a lot of monocultures because they didn't understand just yet some of the value of planting a lot of different kinds of trees. Another kind of tree that was planted a lot to replace elms was the ash tree. And you can see down along Main Street in the southern part of Holyoke, the trees that line Main Street are ash trees, all of them. And if you've been down there recently, you know that the tops of those trees are dying, and there's a new kind of blight wiping out ash trees. So it's a great example of why it's really important not to plant all one kind of tree along any street, because inevitably there's going to be a pest that wipes out one or two of the species that you plant, and you don't want to lose every single tree along a street to one blight, like we saw with the American elm. We're seeing it with ash trees now. Don't plant monocultures. But in the 1980s, they were planting a lot of monocultures. They were planting a lot of these two species. And today, we unfortunately know that the Norway maple is an incredibly aggressive invasive species, and it's starting to take over native forests here in Massachusetts. It is, in fact, actually illegal to plant a Norway maple in Massachusetts today because it is invasive. But it is also the most numerous street tree in Holyoke by like a lot. There's like several hundred. So if you see a maple on the side of the road in Holyoke, it's probably a Norway maple. The Callery pear is also invasive, but it has a lot of other issues, primarily that they have a very weak wood and poor branching structure, which essentially means once they get to a certain size, they can't support their branches. So like any kind of wind, heavy rain sort of pulls them off and creates a lot of debris, creates damage to cars underneath them. They're definitely not an ideal street tree. The one bright spot of the Callery pear is that it's lining Beach Street. And I'm sure all of you know, in the spring, Beach Street becomes sort of this beautiful corridor full of white floaty flowers, and it's sort of a pleasure to drive down. So take the good with the bad. But yeah, so that the loss of the American elm really sort of helps explain why we have the trees in Holyoke today that we do. And now looking towards the future, our newest sort of challenge is climate change. The tree landscape of the future, the one that our children inherit, is going to be shaped by the shifting climate. We're already seeing rising summer temperatures, increased periods of drought that are punctuated by more severe storms with very intense rainfall, so more flooding, more runoff, and a shorter frost period with warmer winters. And yes, David, I'll come back to your question after this. Excited to address that. Yeah, so looking forward, we have all these challenges, and the trees that we have here in Holyoke are really well adjusted towards our climate as it was 100 years ago. But we're already seeing incredibly radical shifts in phrenology, which is essentially the timing of the plant cycle, when trees bloom, when they lose their leaves. We're already seeing a pretty massive shift in that. And I was just talking to the wisteria hurst gardeners in August, and Toy was explaining to me how there are certain varieties of the river beech, which is pictured here, that essentially died just this summer because of the intense heat that they just couldn't handle and are not acclimatized to. So, the city foresters in Holyoke, wisteria hurst gardeners, I hope you guys as well are already starting to think about selecting trees that are going to be resilient in a changing climate, that are going to be able to tolerate more heat, more intense rainfall, stuff like that. And there's definitely a lot of hope in that area. The US Forest Service has basically generated lists of trees that are going to be able to, given what we know about them and their botany, that will hopefully be able to be a little bit more resilient in the face of a changing climate. One of those is the Kentucky coffee tree. So here we're circling back. The Kentucky coffee tree has been native to North America for thousands of years, and it looks like it's going to be one of the ones that survives the changing climate here in the Northeast, and it is very much a recommended planting if anyone's looking for trees that are going to survive long term in their yards. That's a really good one. And Holyoke Heritage State Park is already sort of a bright spot in terms of thinking about climate resiliency. When the park was designed not too long ago, I think the early mid 2000s, it was filled with the most resilient trees. So it actually doesn't have a ton of native species. It has plantings that are sort of the most resilient of their kind. So the Zelkovas, which line the canal in the park, are in the Ulmus sort of family, but are from Europe and are a very, very hardy species of elm that can survive Dutch elm disease and lots of different polluting conditions. I already mentioned the Kentucky coffee tree, and I'm going to end here with the Dawn redwood. That's the Dawn redwood's beautiful ferny foliage, and this is a sapling that is growing in Holyoke Heritage State Park. These are an incredibly hardy species that have survived for millions of years. The Dawn redwood is actually an incredibly common tree in the fossil record. When looking at fossils from approximately 2.5 million years ago, you see lots of Dawn redwood leaves. They were thought to be extinct by archaeologists, paleontologists, until the 1940s, when a scientist in China discovered an old growth grove that were used actually as a temple by some of the local people. And simultaneously in Japan, someone gave the species that they had discovered in the fossil record a name. And then after World War II, once the political tensions between China and Japan sort of thawed a little bit, it was discovered that what was in the fossil record was actually still living in Japan. And at that point, science got really excited. The seeds of the Dawn redwood were spread everywhere in an attempt to repopulate it. And so now Holyoke is starting to reintroduce this tree into the landscape here after like millions of years, which is really cool. But it also shows promise as a climate resilient species for this region. So looking forward to the future, we're going to maybe be seeing a lot more of the Dawn redwood. So that is what I have for you guys today. We moved at breakneck speed through time. So I would love to answer questions, pop them in the chat, or turn your camera on and ask them in person. I'd love to see your faces if you want. But I'm just going to answer David's question here to loop back to Anniversary Hill Park and Scott Tower. My understanding is that the city is looking to improve the park, and it would be helpful to provide your input about the cedar trees. Yes, David, you are correct. I actually talked with Yoni about this before I left in August, and he and I did a little walkthrough of the park. The city is indeed getting ready to, pending, any more worldwide pandemics, planning to clean up the park. There is a plan to maybe clear away some of the brush that's grown up and around the tower, so that there is yet again a really incredible view of the valley and of the city of Holyoke from there. And yes, I think we would like to keep the Eastern red cedars as a central part of that design. Yoni has some really exciting plans for that park. So I would definitely keep your eyes sort of on that space, as they say, to see what happens there in the next couple of years. But yes, I hope they will stay. There not all of them are still there. If you are intrepid and are able to trek up that hill, you'll see the ones on the right. There's a lot of those. The ones on the left, have a lot of them have died, and they're a little bit there. There's some bigger gaps, so it's clear that some have just sort of died in the intervening years. But maybe we'll do some replanting. Yes, Margaret. Yes, that was my primary concern when I had to tramp in there to try to take a core sample from the trees. And I was very terrified of poison ivy. So hopefully that's one of the things that they'll get rid of when the park reopens. Yes, Penny. Great question. No. There are a lot of different trees that have different situations. So a male tree, there's some species that have a male tree and a female tree. For example, the ginkgo tree, another living fossil, very, very old species. It's called being dioecious. So some trees produce male parts, some trees produce female parts, and the male parts then must pollinate the female parts for the tree to reproduce. And some trees are monoecious, which basically means that they can self-reproduce themselves, and the trees don't have gender. And in terms of urban trees, it's less of a concern because urban trees are probably not self-propagating, nor do we necessarily want them to. The foresters will replace trees kind of strategically. But in terms of you planting them in your yard or in a forest, yeah, it's really important that the male and female parts are accessible to each other so that they can reproduce and produce new tree babies. And a lot of urban trees, actually, I didn't mention it, but a lot of urban trees have had their reproductive parts sort of like bred out of them. I am not a scientist, I'm a historian, so do not ask me how they do that. But a lot of like, for example, the honey locusts, which are a really common street tree in Holyoke, they are bred to grow without those woody pods that contain their seeds. So there's less tree debris that falls onto the street and onto the sidewalk. And that's really common in the trees that they plant now. They don't even have reproductive capabilities. Anybody else have questions, thoughts, reactions? Thank you, David. Yes, I really encourage all of you, like Penny mentioned in the beginning, as you move around town next week, just sort of keep an eye out for, maybe see how many different kinds of trees you can spot, or do a familiar drive and see if you can see anything interesting. I mean, just driving around Holyoke, there are some amazing specimens of trees. And as I hope I've sort of hinted at today, they indicate, periods in the past that we maybe would have forgotten, or don't know, there's still sort of that historic residue lives on through the trees. So just kind of don't crash your car, which I almost did numerous times while, stopping to look at trees. But yeah, keep an eye out on your next journey around town.
And I just want to pitch for the culmination of Michaela's work. She came up with a tree guide for the city. And so you can access an electronic version of that on the conservation department. Is it right?
Yeah, the Department of Conservation and Sustainability, which is on like the Holyoke website. It's just under that.
Right.
Or if you Google Holyoke Historic Tree Project, it
Right.
comes right up. There is also a web version, which I can share. I don't have the link with me immediately, but and there is also going to be a Spanish version. I sort of dropped the ball on. I got the Spanish version like a month after I finished, so I haven't had time. But I am working on that so that we can have a bilingual version if that's helpful to anyone. So stay tuned for that. I'm hoping to get that done in the next week.
This has been great, Michaela. Thank you so much. Um, yes, and I think mostly thank you for your passion and your excitement about it, because that really has helped a lot of people, look at things differently in Holyoke, and that's really great. So,
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad to hear it. Thanks
yeah.
everybody for tuning in. It's been just an honor to be able to talk your ear off for an hour. About trees, my favorite subject.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michaela, for coming back. If anyone has questions for Michaela that they didn't get to ask today or that they remember, feel free to send me an email. I'm the person who sent you the link to this program, and I'd be happy to pass it on to Michaela.
Yes. And if you want to send me an email, I receive emails at Holyoke Trees at holyoke.org. I'm just going to pop that in the chat. Um, if you just want to share a cool picture of a tree in your yard, you get excited, whatever, like send me an email because I would love to hear about it.
All right, everyone. Thanks again for showing up. Hope we see you again in the near future. And stay well.
Thanks. Bye.